The word true indicates the aim of logic, as does beautiful that of aesthetics, or good that of ethics. All sciences have truth as their goal, but logic is also concerned with it in a quite different way from this. It has much the same relation to truth as physics has to weight or heat. To discover truths is the task of all sciences. It falls to logic to discern the laws of truth. The word law is used in two senses. When we speak of laws, of morals, or the state, we mean regulations which ought to be obeyed, but with which actual happenings are not always in conformity. Laws of nature are the generalization of natural occurrences with which the occurrences are always in accordance. It is rather in this sense that I speak of laws of truth. This is, to be sure, not a matter of what happens so much as of what is. Rules for asserting, thinking, judging, inferring follow from the laws of truth, and thus one can very well speak of laws of thought too. But there is an imminent danger here of mixing different things up. Perhaps the expression law of thought is interpreted by analogy with law of nature, and the generalization of thinking as a mental occurrence is meant by it. A law of thought in this sense would be a psychological law, and so one might come to believe that logic deals with the mental process of thinking and the psychological laws in accordance with which it takes place. This would be a misunderstanding of the task of logic, for truth has not been given the place which it is due here. Error and superstition have causes just as much as genuine knowledge. The assertion both of what is false and of what is true takes place in accordance with psychological laws. A derivation from these and an explanation of a mental process that terminates in an assertion can never take the place of a proof of what is asserted. Could not logical laws also have played a part in this mental process? I do not want to dispute this. But when it is a question of truth, possibility is not enough, for it is also possible that something not logical played a part in the process and deflected it from the truth. We can only decide this after we have discerned the laws of truth, but then we will probably be able to do without the derivation and explanation of the mental process if it is important to us to decide whether the assertion in which the process terminates is justified. In order to avoid this misunderstanding and to prevent the blurring of the boundary between psychology and logic, I assign to logic the task of discovering the laws of truth, not of assertion or thought. The meaning of the word true is explained by the laws of truth. But first, I shall attempt to outline roughly what I want to call true in this connection. In this way, other uses of our word may be excluded. It is not to be used here in the sense of genuine or veracious, nor as it sometimes occurs in the treatment of questions of art, when, for example, truth in art is discussed. When truth is set up as the goal of art, when the truth of a work of art or true feeling is spoken of. The word true is put in front of another word in order to show that this word is to be understood in its proper, unadulterated sense. This use, too, lies off the path followed here. That kind of truth is meant whose recognition is the goal of science. Grammatically, the word true appears as an adjective. Hence, the desire arises to delimit more closely the sphere in which truth can be affirmed, in which truth comes into the question at all. One finds truth affirmed of pictures, ideas, statements, and thoughts. It is striking that visible and audible things occur here alongside things which cannot be perceived with the senses. This hints that shifts of meaning have taken place. Indeed, is a picture then, as a mere visible and tangible thing, really true? And a stone, a leaf, not true? Obviously, one would not call a picture true unless there were an intention behind it. A picture must represent something. Furthermore, an idea is not called true in itself, but only with respect to an intention that it should correspond to something. It might be supposed from this truth consists in the correspondence of a picture with what it depicts. Correspondence is a relation. This is contradicted, however, by the use of the word true, which is not a relation word and contains no reference to anything else to which something must correspond. If I do not know that a picture is meant to represent Köln Cathedral, then I do not know with what to compare the picture to decide on its truth. A correspondence, moreover, can only be perfect if the corresponding things coincide and are therefore not distinct things at all. It is said to be possible to establish the authenticity of a banknote by comparing it stereotypically with an authentic one. But it would be ridiculous to try to compare a gold piece with a 20-mark note stereoscopically. It would only be possible to compare an idea with a thing if the thing were an idea too. And then, if the first did correspond perfectly with the second, they would coincide. But this is not at all what is wanted when truth is defined as the correspondence of an idea with something real. For it is absolutely essential that the reality be distinct from the idea. But then there can be no complete correspondence, no complete truth. So nothing at all would be true. For what is only half true is untrue. Truth cannot tolerate a more or less. But yet, can it not be laid down that truth exists when there is correspondence in a certain respect? But in which? For what would we then have to do to decide whether something were true? We should have to inquire whether it were true that an idea and a reality, perhaps, correspond in the laid down respect. And then we should be confronted by a question of the same kind, and the game could begin again. So the attempt to explain truth as correspondence collapses, and every other attempt to define truth collapses too. For in a definition, certain characteristics would have to be stated, and in application to any particular case, the question would always arise whether it were true that the characteristics were present. So one goes round in a circle. Consequently, it is probable that the content of the word true is unique and indefinable. When one ascribes truth to a picture, one does not really want to ascribe a property which belongs to this picture altogether independently of other things. But one always has something quite different in mind, and one wants to say that that picture corresponds in some way to this thing. My idea corresponds to Köln Cathedral is a sentence, and the question now arises of the truth of this sentence. So what is improperly called the truth of pictures and ideas is reduced to the truth of sentences. What does one call a sentence? A series of sounds, but only when it has a sense, by which is not meant that every series of sounds that has a sense is a sentence. And when we call a sentence true, we really mean its senses, from which it follows that it is for the sense of a sentence that the question of truth arises in general. Now, is the sense of a sentence an idea? In any case, being true does not consist in the correspondence of this sense with something else, for otherwise the question of truth would reiterate itself to infinity. Without wishing to give a definition, I call a thought something for which the question of truth arises. So I ascribe what is false to a thought just as much as what is true. So I can say, the thought is the sense of the sentence without wishing to say, as well, that the sense of every sentence is a thought. The thought, in itself immaterial, clothes itself in the material garment of a sentence and thereby becomes comprehensible to us. We say a sentence expresses a thought. A thought is something immaterial, and everything material and perceptible is excluded from this sphere of that for which the question of truth arises. Truth is not a quality that corresponds with a particular kind of sense impression. So it is sharply distinguished from the qualities which we denote by the words red, bitter, lilac smelling. But do we not see that the sun has risen, and do we not then also see that this is true? That the sun has risen is not an object which emits rays that reach my eyes. It is not a visible thing like the sun itself. That the sun has risen is seen to be true on the basis of the sense impressions. But being true is not a material perceptible property, for being magnetic is also recognized on the basis of sense impressions of something, though this property corresponds as little as truth with a particular kind of sense impressions. So far, these properties agree. However, we need sense impressions in order to recognize a body as magnetic. On the other hand, when I find that it is true that I do not smell anything at this moment, I do not do so on the basis of sense impressions. It may nevertheless be thought that we cannot recognize a property of a thing without at the same time realizing that the thought that this thing has this property to be true. So with every property of a thing is joined a property of a thought, namely that of truth. It is also worthy of notice that the sentence, I smell the scent of violets, has just the same content as the sentence, it is true that I smell the scent of violets. So it seems then that nothing is added to the thought by my ascribing to it the property of truth. And yet, is it not a great result when the scientist, after much hesitation and careful inquiry, can finally say, what I supposed is true? The meaning of the word true seems to be altogether unique. May we not be dealing here with something which cannot, in the ordinary sense, be called a quality at all? In spite of this doubt, I want first to express myself in accordance with ordinary usage, as if truth were a quality, until something more to the point is found. In order to work out more precisely what I want to call thought, I shall distinguish various kinds of sentences. One does not want to deny sense to an imperative sentence, but this sense is not such that the question of truth could arise for it. Therefore, I shall not call the sense of an imperative sentence a thought. Sentences expressing desires or requests are ruled out in the same way. Only those sentences in which we communicate or state something come into the question. But I do not count among these exclamations in which one vents one's feelings, groaning, sighing, laughing, unless it has been decided by some agreement that they are to communicate something. But how about interrogative sentences? In a word question, we utter an incomplete sentence in which only obtains a true sense through the completion for which we ask. Word questions are accordingly left out of consideration here. Sentence questions are a different matter. We expect to hear yes or no. The answer yes means the same as an indicative sentence, for in it the thought that was already completely contained in the interrogative sentence is laid down as true. So a sentence question can be formed from every indicative sentence. An exclamation cannot be regarded as communication on this account, since no corresponding sentence question can be formed. An interrogative sentence and an indicative one contain the same thought, But the indicative contains something else as well, namely the assertion. The interrogative sentence contains something more too, namely a request. Therefore, two things must be distinguished in an indicative sentence: the content, which it has in common with the corresponding sentence question, and the assertion. The former is the thought, or at least contains the thought. So it is possible to express the thought without laying it down as true. Both are so closely joined in an indicative sentence that it is easy to overlook their separability. Consequently, we may distinguish 1. The apprehension of a thought, thinking. 2. The recognition of the truth of a thought, judgment. 3. The manifestation of this judgment, assertion. We perform the first act when we form a sentence question. An advance in science usually takes place in this way. First, a thought is apprehended, such as can perhaps be expressed in a sentence question, and, after appropriate investigations, this thought is finally recognized to be true. We declare the recognition of truth in the form of an indicative sentence. We do not have to use the word true for this. And even when we do use it, the real assertive force lies not in it, but in the form of the indicative sentence, and where this loses its assertive force, the word true cannot put it back again. This happens when we do not speak seriously. As stage thunder is only apparent thunder, and a stage fight is only an apparent fight, so stage assertion is only apparent assertion. It is only acting, only fancy. In his part, the actor asserts nothing, nor does he lie. Even if he says something of whose falsehood he is convinced. In poetry, we have the case of thoughts being expressed without being actually put forward as true in spite of the form of the indicative sentence, although it may be suggested to the hearer to make an assenting judgment himself. Therefore, it must still always be asked about what is presented in the form of an indicative sentence, whether it really contains an assertion. And this question must be answered in the negative if the requisite seriousness is lacking. It is irrelevant whether the word true is used here. This explains why it is that nothing seems to be added to a thought by attributing to it the property of truth. An indicative sentence often contains as well as a thought as the assertion, a third component over which the assertion does not extend. This is often said to act on the feelings, the mood of the hearer, or to arouse his imagination. Words like alas and thank God belong here. Such constituents of sentences are more noticeably prominent in poetry, but are seldom wholly absent from prose. They occur more rarely in mathematical, physical, or chemical than in historical expositions. What are called the humanities are more closely connected with poetry and are therefore less scientific than the exact sciences, which are drier the more exact they are, for exact science is directed towards truth and only truth. Therefore, all constituents of sentences to which the assertive force does not reach do not belong to scientific exposition, but they are sometimes hard to avoid, even for one who sees the danger connected with them. Where the main thing is to approach what cannot be grasped in thought by means of guesswork, these components have their justification. The more exactly scientific an exposition is, the less will the nationality of its author be discernible, and the easier will it be to translate. On the other hand, the constituents of language, to which I want to call attention here, make the translation of poetry very difficult, even make a complete translation almost always impossible, for it is in precisely that in which poetic value largely consists that language differ most. It makes no difference to the thought whether I use the word horse or steed or cart horse or mare. The assertive force does not extend over that in which these words differ. What is called mood, fragrance, illumination in a poem What is portrayed by cadence and rhythm does not belong to the thought. Much of language serves the purpose of aiding the hearer's understanding, for instance, the stressing of a part of a sentence by accentuating or word order. One should remember words like still and already, too. With the sentence, Alfred has still not come, one really says, Alfred has not come, and at the same time hints that his arrival is expected, but it is only hinted.